So this morning, as you guys might realize, we're starting a new series, or continuing on in a new series, but we're doing something different this morning. One of the reasons that I really like what we're doing in this series is that we get to hear from other people, right? I mean, you guys have to listen to me talk every week, and I think it's great that we get to hear other people's testimonies because, you know, God works in all of our lives, right? Not just the staff or the pastors or whatever, right? Like, He works in all of our lives, so we all should have a chance to share these type of things. And when I look around this morning, I get excited to see that our church is active and people are doing things. I mean, you know, this morning Jacob does announcements and he's talking to different people on the worship team. This morning I was talking to Rick Kalowski, and he set up communion, and then he's doing security usher, and he was being a greeter this morning. So Rick, come on up, give the sermon this morning. I don't think you're prepared for that. All right. So what we're really going to do is this morning, in this series, we're going to hear our first testimony from somebody who's not me, and I'm really excited about this one personally because it's one that I get to be a part of and live outside of these four walls. So if you guys would, I would appreciate you guys welcoming my daughter, Grace Johnston.
Now is it on? Good morning. So when I was first, not figuring out, but like writing out my testimony, was a couple months back for an event at my school. And I sat down with one of my friends who decided to go up and give it in front of our peers. And we started writing it together, and we were like, okay, when does a testimony really start? So for me, I think, mine kind of starts at birth. My dad is the pastor here. Obviously, I've grown up in a Christian household. I would go on Tuesdays to this after-school Bible class, and then Awanas, VBS, any extracurricular Christian activity, I was probably a part of. So the church has been a pretty big part of my life forever, really. And not everybody in my family has been the same way. I have aunts and uncles or just family friends who have crazy testimonies of different kind of addictions and other struggles. And growing up, I would hear these things and think, well, I never faced anything like that. What does that mean for my testimony? But that was never something I actually had in-depth thoughts about until I sat down to write my testimony out. So when my testimony gets interesting, I would say, it was probably around 4th grade. If you don't know, my family's from California, and that's where I spent the first 9 or 10 years of my life, until one day, my parents sat my brother and I down at the dinner table and said, hey kids, we're moving. So we ended up moving across the country to North Carolina. And for me, this was really upsetting because this was when I had first started to develop somewhat meaningful friendships. When you're in 1st grade, how meaningful can your friendships really be? But, I was starting to grow up at least a little bit and make connections with people at school. So I was sad to say goodbye to them. And when we did get to North Carolina, I made some new friends. It was nice. And then I ended up going to a different school, a different junior high than all of the friends I had made. And so I was like, okay, got to make new friends again. So these new friends I had made in junior high ended up not being the best influence on me. And I ended up going behind my parents' back and downloading various social media platforms, even though I knew that was against the rules, which maybe doesn't sound like a huge deal, but the way I use these social media platforms, I use them as an outlet to start finding new identities to label myself with. And through this whole process, I neglected the label of Christian. And I forgot that was really the only true label I needed and the only important one. And I got distracted by everything on social media. And with every new identity I saw online, nothing was ever sufficient, and it always just left me feeling empty. And through this whole process, I didn't tell my parents, obviously, because I didn't want to get in trouble. And this was the first major lie I told in my life. So I think my story is best characterized into 3 lies, and this is the first one. And I think I didn't want my parents to know who I was because I didn't know who I was myself. And so I started just not being a real person, really. I was kind of just like an empty shell of a person is what it felt like. And I just tried so hard to figure out who I was. And eventually, my parents sat my brother and I down again and said, hey, we're moving again. And we ended up moving here. And this is where lie number 2 kind of comes into play. So we moved here a little before COVID. And once COVID did hit, there was, as I'm sure you guys know, a lot of isolation for me, both physically and mentally. I never had the chance to create strong friendships before the quarantine, everything hit. So I was kind of left alone because I didn't have those friends, and I had neglected to make strong relationships with my family because I didn't want them to know who I was. So I started to develop a very strong, irrational fear of talking to my parents on any deep level at all, which, heightened the isolation even more. And I kind of had some dark thoughts that started to seep into my mind. And at first it wasn't too bad, I could kind of ignore them. But progressively it got worse and worse, as those things tend to do. And eventually it was the only thing I could think about. The way I decided to deal with this was with self-harm. And until one day I decided I was going to take my own life. That night I swallowed 14 sleeping pills, hoping that I wouldn't wake up the next morning. But the good news is that's not where it ends. I didn't tell anybody this when it first happened. And I thought it would be a secret that I took to my grave, which clearly isn't true because I'm up here telling everybody right now. But one night, after I had started to try and deal with these dark feelings on my own, they started to kind of go away. And one night I was at my friend's house, and they started to come back. And for her, it was very noticeable, and she called me out, and she was like, what is going on with you? And I explained everything to her, and she was like, I'm calling your parents right now. And so it was probably midnight. My mom and dad came and picked me up, and they were like, what's going on? We have no idea what you're talking about. Like, this is completely out of the blue. So I explained everything to them. I told them everything about what I had been doing on social media, everything I'd been struggling with for the past 2 years. And this conversation is what made me realize maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. Maybe being close to my parents could be a good thing, and that maybe there's benefits that go along with that. So I decided maybe I'm going to try and fix this. But still, it wasn't perfect. I would still feel occasional loneliness. And the biggest part was that even though I wanted to have a relationship with my parents, I wasn't ready to have a relationship with God. I still had a void in my heart, and I didn't understand why I felt so empty. Looking back, it's because I know the only way to fix that is by having a relationship with God. But I ignored that, and I tried to fill this hole in my heart with other relationships that I idolized. And this kind of revived my habit of lying to my parents. And some of these relationships I would hide from my parents until one day I once more got caught, and my mom confronted me about it. And this, I think, is probably the biggest turning point in my faith. I was having a conversation with my mom, and she said, well, when I was figuring out what I was going to write down to tell you guys, when I was talking to my mom about this conversation, she said she doesn't even remember her saying these things. She felt like it was the Holy Spirit speaking through her, and I completely agree. I remember specifically the words, "I don't even know who you are anymore," came out of my mom's mouth. And that, for me, was just wild to hear my own mother tell me that. But it wasn't her fault. It was my fault because I had neglected to have a healthy relationship with her. She was pouring in, and I was not pouring in the same way. So that was definitely my final blow, where I realized I need Jesus, and I can't keep living like this. So through those 5 years of deceit and struggle, I didn't have a relationship with God, but now I do. I know that God commands you to respect your father and mother, and so I no longer lie to my parents. I have decided to fix that relationship, and now my parents are arguably the most important people in my life. They're my support system, and they encourage me to pursue not just any relationship with God, but a relationship with God that's personal and my own. And it has been a long journey, and I know it's probably not done, but I have definitely come a long way, and I know that Jesus bears my burdens and that I don't have to live that same way before. And I will always remember that regardless of how alone I feel, I know that God is always right there beside me and will be there with me through everything. And I hope that's something that you guys can remember too.
Well, church, I think my voice is going to be a little rocky here for a minute. You know, when Gracie first stood up in front of her school to tell that story, I was really proud. And it wasn't that her struggles made me particularly glad, but I think the biggest moment of pride for me was that when things were going wrong, I could see that God was still at work in her life. And nothing honestly brings me more joy than to see my daughter with her own genuine relationship with Christ. It wasn't something we could force on her, right? I mean, that's kind of the pressure that you get being a pastor's kid, right? Is that pressure of, oh, well, you got to behave, you got to follow the rules and all that kind of stuff, right? It's naturally there. And honestly, there's a lot of pressure on a pastor's family in general. Everyone has expectations of a pastor's family, whether they like it or not, right? You may try not to, but it's true. And when I was hired here, I repeated the words to the hiring committee that a mentor gave me. I said, you have to remember you're hiring me and not my family. You don't get to place any expectation on them that you wouldn't place on any other Christian in your church. If you want more than that, you put them on the payroll. That was the advice that was given to me by my mentor. And I truly believe that's the right way to do it. I think that's right. But that still doesn't stop people from placing expectations anyway, right? Well, shouldn't the pastor's wife lead this ministry? Or shouldn't the pastor's kids know all the answers in Sunday school? Or shouldn't the pastor's family be here or do this? And that pressure gets there. But the thing is, if you open up that Bible that's sitting in front of you, you won't read anything about a pastor's family in there that doesn't apply to every other Christian. And I think that that's the most challenging part for the pastor's family, is that they don't have a voice. Right? I get to stand up here and talk to everybody for 30 minutes every week. I get to speak into the situations I'm dealing with. Now, you may sleep through me talking, but at least I have the chance to say it, right? But pastors' families don't. And I think that's a major reason why we've all probably heard the term PK. Anybody ever heard of a PK in here before? Pastor's kid? Right? Because they're known to be the people that have the best behavior or the worst behavior, right? You get one or the other. And I think that's because I think there's a feeling you can't escape where you kind of feel trapped, right? All these expectations get laid on the pastor's family that they didn't ask for. And so sometimes they want to push back against that pressure. Now, thank God, in general, at our church, you all love me and my family very well. We're not in some hostile situation like some churches and pastors are. But what I think is interesting is what Gracie just shared with us, and I think about the pressure she was facing and the expectations that she was facing. I see that they didn't really come from the church. In a way, they kind of came from me. Because when we moved here from North Carolina, where she was going through those formative years, where she had her friends and she was in junior high, she'd been accepted to this wonderful school. And if you don't know this about my daughter, she loves school. She loves it. She would go every day if she could. Just this last week, she was vomiting for a few days, and when I was coming into the office, she was still sick at home, and by the time I got home, she was at school. She felt better and wanted to go. And all I could think was, in my life, I have never been so foolish as a kid to miss a perfectly good sick day simply because I felt better. Anyway, when we got here, Gracie had been in junior high in Greensboro because they started junior high in 6th grade. But when we moved here, they don't start until 7th grade, so she had to go back from junior high to elementary school, which is odd for somebody who likes school and is moving up, right? Not only that, but she was at a magnet school in North Carolina where, she could learn Latin and other smart people things that I would never be able to do in school. And the thing is, I knew that coming here was hard on her. I knew she was having a bit of a tough time, but I was so busy trying to adjust to being a senior pastor in a new church in a new city at the start of a pandemic while renovating our house, trying to move in before the Airbnb ran out. I was so busy doing that I didn't pay enough attention. Sorry, when I practiced this, I got through that okay. I didn't pay enough attention to my daughter's struggles. So it took years before I found out how difficult it was. Sorry, church.
Is that why you brought the towel?
Quit jumping ahead on me, Steve. When I heard about the pills, figuring out that your daughter made an effort, it caused me to look at myself and realize that I had expectations. I had an expectation that my daughter could handle the adjustment on her own. I thought that she would be okay, and so I didn't investigate enough. And that expectation is unfair. In church, we all have expectations. I'm sorry, if this is your first time here, I don't do this every week, I swear. Thank you, Mary. Okay. We all have expectations. I know that you guys have expectations of me, you have expectations of your spouse, you have expectations of your kids, you have expectations of your friends and your family and your coworkers and our politicians. When you're on the road, you have expectations of other drivers, right? You probably even had an expectation of what Gracie, the PK, was going to say when she started speaking, right? I don't know what that expectation was, but I'm willing to bet that it was probably different than what you expected. Most tension between people comes because there are expectations that are not met. Sometimes those expectations are reasonable, sometimes they are not, and sometimes they would be if we learned how to handle them better. So if you're following along with your sermon notes this morning, we're just starting the sermon at this point. Today's message is called Renew Your Expectations. We're in Matthew chapter 11, looking at verses 2 through 6, so it's a short passage today. But before we hop into the text, I want to set the scene. If you remember back to our series called Represent, we were talking about Israel's prophets, and they've been waiting for this guy, the Messiah, to come fix everything they had messed up, and eventually he does come, and he comes as Jesus of Nazareth. And he comes on the path that is special, it comes on a path that a special prophet laid for him, and it's a guy named John the Baptist, who was sent as Jesus' forerunner. And he was sent to make straight the path of the Lord. And John does a really good job with this throughout his career. He's baptizing people in the Jordan, including Jesus, by the way. He declares who Jesus is. He says he's the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. He sends many of his followers over to Jesus, and he continues to go around preaching about the kingdom of God until he ends up in prison, because he called out Herod Antipas for divorcing his wife so that he could marry his sister-in-law. Now, at this point in John's story, he had done everything that had been asked of him. And so when we get to Matthew chapter 11, John has to confront something. He has to confront his unmet expectations. So we're going to talk about that. Let's go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 2. Now, when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another. Now, John isn't attacking Jesus here. He's just confused by him, right? He's like, I've been proclaiming all this stuff, so where is it? Aren't you going to rule and reign? Isn't the government going to be on your shoulders? Why aren't you smashing the Romans and ushering in God's kingdom like you said, or like I've been saying? In other words, what John is saying is, hey, Jesus, why haven't you met my expectations? Well, we know this because we know that that's how John was struggling, that he had expectations that weren't met, because if Jesus was doing everything John expected, he wouldn't have had to ask him if he was the guy. Right? So for John, something wasn't lining up. But here's your first fill in the blank this morning, church. Jesus didn't come to just meet our expectations. Jesus didn't just come to meet our expectations, and that's because we expected the wrong thing. I mean, how often do we place expectations on people and we struggle when they don't meet them? Okay, now it's time for the towel. Okay? How many of us have ever had a tense conversation in our household about one of these? Anybody? Nobody ever? Well, here's the problem. Nobody knows the right way to fold a towel, okay? And the problem is because everybody has a different right way to fold a towel, right? Now, okay, how many of you fold it like the left? Okay, really, you guys are crazy. All right, how about the middle? How many of you fold like the middle? Okay, right there. How many of us do what's on the right? Okay, good to know. Right? Now, this seems like a small thing, a towel, right? I mean, what's the big deal about a towel? I should tell you, this is not one of our towels. It's all grungy and stuff. This is used to clean the basement floor. So before you guys are like, oh my gosh, that's what he dries himself with? It's not. Now here's the thing. It seems like hell is going to be full of a bunch of people with wrongly folded towels. Because if your spouse does it different than you, they're what? Wrong, right? They're wrong. Church, that is called an expectation, okay? Why do you leave dishes in the sink instead of putting them in the dishwasher? Why don't you roll your toothpaste tube instead of squeezing it like a Neanderthal? We are often so angry when people don't meet our expectations. And as I said before, sometimes they're reasonable, but it doesn't matter whether they're reasonable or not if they're not communicated. A lot of times I'll hear an argument between a couple, and it's like, you know what, it was my birthday, and I woke up, and he's just sitting there on the couch. He didn't make me breakfast. He didn't sing me happy birthday. He didn't even have a card. My mother did that for me every year until I moved out. It's like, oh, really? Did your husband also grow up with your mother? No, his mother didn't do anything for his birthday, but it's important to me. Have you ever told him it's important to you? And then what's the response I hear after that? I shouldn't have to tell him it's important to me. Church, that is a set of expectations right there. Not only do you expect someone to do X, Y, Z, but you also expect to never have to communicate it to them. I should just get what I want because I want it, and it's their job to know that, even if I don't tell them. You know, one area where there's been a victory about this in my marriage is our Christmas decorations. Because when I was a kid, our Christmases were outrageous. Okay, every square inch of the house was covered in decorations by like August. And we always had like a huge, beautiful, real tree in its own room. And on Christmas morning, that room was full of presents. And we had so many presents that the neighbors actually got mad at my parents for making them look bad, okay? And I never had to do a thing to get Christmas ready, all right? Now, Tasha, on the other hand, my kids call her Doofenshmirtz. Now, if you don't know who Doofenshmirtz is, okay? He's the likable villain on Phineas and Ferb, and he always tells stories about his childhood that are terrible, okay? Like both of his parents failed to show up at his birth. At 5, he had to throw his own surprise party. The only good things about his childhood were his pet cockroach and his garlic-flavored ice cream, okay? So my kids call Tasha Doofenshmirtz because her childhood stories are always the opposite of mine, okay? Now, they're just teasing her, but you get it, okay? Now, as you might guess, Tosh did not grow up with Christmases like mine. So when we got married, she started decorating our house like crazy in order to make me happy. And after a while, I noticed that she wasn't particularly joyful about it, okay? You know, honestly, a big Christmas is a lot of work for someone who it isn't important to, right? So we sat down and we talked it out because she did it to make me happy. And it turns out, even though I do like a big Christmas, I like Christmas way more when my wife gets to enjoy it with me, right? So really what we found out was my only expectations for Christmas are I want a tree, stockings, and lights on the front of the house. And so that's basically what we do, right? When it's time, I go out, I bring in all the stuff from the shed, and I go outside and put up the Christmas lights while she fluffs the trees for 6 months and then handles the tree and the stockings, the decorations. And it's great. It works out really well for us. And ever since we started doing that, Christmas has been far more enjoyable for both of us, simply because we made our expectations clear, we compromised, and we agreed upon it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Do I really need to communicate every expectation? Do I really need to tell him not to pee on the toilet seat? To that, all I got to say is, yes, go into any men's restroom and you will see that most men don't have any expectations in that area. No, but I do get it. I get it, right? Of course, there are some things in life that should just be obvious, right? And I'm sure that you could probably think of 10 examples in your head right now of someone in your life who messes up those expectations that should be so basic that you can't believe that they don't do that. But I'm not just saying that, hey, if you start communicating your expectations, everything will be perfect, because the reality is our world is full of expectations, right? And that world around our expectations is a very complicated, very sad battleground. It's hard. How was I supposed to know the spoons go in this drawer? Why does she always set the trash by the front door? These little things pile up and take place every day because people will always let us down. So what do we do with this? Well, actually, when it comes to our expectations not being met, do you realize that Jesus has expectations of us, of how we're supposed to respond to our unmet expectations? In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, it says, I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. How are we supposed to walk? With all humility, gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. Then later on, if we jump down to verse 32 in that same passage, it says, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. So that's the secret sauce right there, church. He says to bear with one another with love and to forgive one another. And you're thinking, wait, I have to bear with this idiot in love? I can't keep a permanent list of mistakes running in my head? Well, think about the words we just read: humility, gentleness, patience, tender-hearted. Ask yourself, is this how I act when somebody doesn't meet my expectations? And don't lie to yourself. Sure, I do all those things. You remember that later on when you scream across the house, dang it, Bob, how many times have I told you? Because if anybody deserves to be yelled at, it's Bob. If we're honest, it's hard to face unmet expectations with patience and love and forgiveness. But we're supposed to, because of our next fill in the blank. Jesus has expectations of us. And every time we respond with anger or vengeance or disgust, we're not meeting Jesus' expectations. So before he starts railing off against Jesus here and calling him a false Messiah, John does something very smart. He asks for clarification. Jesus, are you the guy or not? Well, let's take a look at Matthew 11:4. And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. See, John had been boldly preaching about this Messiah, and he'd been talking about justice and judgment and the establishment of God's kingdom in a powerful, unmistakable way. And when he was preaching that, he started creating an image of this work in his own head, and Jesus wasn't matching it. And so now he can't help but focus on what Jesus isn't doing. And he asks, Jesus, are you the one we've been waiting for? And Jesus doesn't really answer directly because it's a loaded question. What is John asking exactly? If he's asking if Jesus is the military and political force that's going to wipe out Rome and restore Israel as a nation, well, that answer is not really. But if he's asking if he's the one true king who's come to take away the sins of the world, well, then that answer would be yes. And John doesn't seem to realize that those are two very different questions. He seems to think that Jesus is either all of it or none of it. And so Jesus' response just simply redefines John's expectations. And here's what John needs to know. Matthew 11:5. Remember, that's what we just read. He said, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. That's what you need to know, John. What Jesus really says is, I'm here to do the work of God, not just meet your expectations. And thank God for that. Your next fill in the blank. Jesus came to do the will of God. He didn't just come here to try to make everybody happy, because that's impossible. He came here to do the work of God. And I think, even though we know that, I think most of us can identify with John's experience, though. We build up expectations of what God's going to do, only to be disappointed when his plan is different than what we thought. We think, I'm sick, so God will heal me. I do good things, so I'm going to get a raise. I've been praying, so God will send me a godly wife or godly husband. And if he doesn't, we start to doubt whether God is actually even at work in our lives. But just like Jesus does for John, we need to have our own expectations reset. Look at Jesus' response. He mentions blind, lepers, deaf, the dead, and the poor. Why? Well, because the kingdom isn't Jerusalem, it's not Israel, it's not Rome. The kingdom of God is people. He didn't come for the political stuff, he came for the people. That's why Jesus was here. He redefines what the kingdom is at the most basic level. Jesus was fulfilling God's promises just in a way that was different than what John was thinking. And so what's crucial here is that Jesus is asking John and us to just trust what God is doing. It's okay if it's not what you think, but just trust that God knows what he's doing here. In our church, we might also feel compelled sometimes to talk ourselves into believing, well, God isn't working here because we don't have another 10,000 square feet of facility. We don't have another 3,000 people in the door. We don't have another $1 million in the budget. But just because we may not have those things doesn't mean God isn't moving. Because if you look around, you'll see God coming and healing in the transformation of hearts and even in small acts of grace that we give when others don't meet our expectations. And those things are really hard to put on a spreadsheet or to bring up here and put under a spotlight. But when we learn to see things from God's perspective, we are reminded that his ways are higher than ours. But then Jesus says one more thing in verse 6. He says, "And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Jesus finishes his response with a blessing. If what Jesus is doing doesn't offend us, we are blessed. Which suggests that our own expectations then can be offensive to our faith in him. Right? Our expectations can get in the way of us following Jesus. We might get frustrated with God, question his goodness, or walk away if things aren't going the way we think they should be. But if that's happening, the problem is with us, not with God. And so this blessing that Jesus is talking about is for those who remain faithful even when things don't unfold like we wanted them to. And at the end of all this, I learned a very important lesson from both God and my daughter. Both God and Gracie have not met my expectations, but they have redefined them and exceeded them. And so your last fill in the blank, church, is God wants to redefine your expectations. God isn't interested in doing what you or anyone else wants him to do, simply for the sake of showing you that he can do it. No, when we say the word fight, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." When the world said we hate them, Jesus said, "Then love your enemies." And when the world said it's time for us to win, Jesus said, "But I came for the losers." If you keep your expectations where the world wants to define them, God will not meet your expectations because he doesn't have to and probably doesn't want to. But if you let him renew your expectations, God will blow your mind.